Hello everyone, welcome to this video on chapter 4 and the Gothic setting that Stevenson creates during the murder of Sir Danvers Carew. So just before I begin talking you through the extract for task 18, I've just put together again a brief summary for you of what happens in chapter 4. So of course we've got the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, where the maid witnesses Carew getting murdered by Hyde, who beats him with a walking stick. You can hear his bones being crushed. Hyde then stamps on the body, and the maid witnesses it from a house nearby and faints because of the trauma of what she sees. Now, later in the chapter, Mr. Utterson is contacted, of course, because the body of Sir Danvers Carew has a letter addressed to him, and Mr. Utterson gets involved because he identifies the dead man, but he also recognises the cane that was given to Dr. Jekyll that had been used as the murder weapon. And then they go to Hyde's lodgings in the run-down part of London in Soho, and they have a look around the rooms, and they find some clues that again kind of confirm suspicions that it was definitely Hyde that committed the murder, and Utterson continues to make links between Jekyll and Hyde, and that's where the police start their investigations. There we go. Okay, so the extract, how do I get rid of this? There we go. So the extract that we are looking at, as I say, is from chapter 4. I'm just going to read through it. You'll see that I've picked out some key quotes there. So in your own copies, feel free to identify these as well as key quotes, or if you see any others yourself, do highlight those. It was by this time about 9 a.m, and the first fog of the season. A great chocolate-coloured pall lowered over heaven, but the wind was continually charging and rooting these embattled vapours, so that as the cab crawled from street to street, Mr. Utterson beheld a marvellous number of degrees and hues of twilight. For here it would be dark like the back end of evening, and there would be a glow of a rich, lurid brown, like the light of some strange conflagration, and here, for a moment, the fog would be quite broken up, and a haggard shaft of daylight would glance in between the swirling reefs. The dismal quarter of Soho, seen under these changing glimpses, with its muddy ways and slatternly passengers, and its lamps, which had never been extinguished or had been kindled afresh to combat the mournful reinvasion of darkness, seemed, in the lawyer's eyes, like a district of some city in a nightmare. The thoughts of his mind, besides, were of the gloomiest dye, and when he glanced at the companion of his drive, he was conscious of some touch of that terror of the law and the law's officers, which may at times assail the most honest. As the cab drew up before the address indicated, the fog lifted a little and showed him a dingy street, a gin palace, a low French eating house, a shop for the retail of penny numbers and two-penny salads, many ragged children huddled in the doorways, and many women of different nationalities passing out, key in hand, to have a morning glass. And the next moment, the fog settled down again upon that part, as brown as umber, and cut him off from his blackguardly surroundings. This was the home of Henry Jekyll's favourite, of a man who was heir to £250,000 sterling. Okay, so the first question on this task asks you about how Stevenson uses Gothic elements to describe Utterson's journey to Hyde's house. So on the lookout for links to obscurity, or this idea that vision becomes poor, Utterson's vision becomes poor in the extract. Pathetic fallacy, which is of course where the weather is used to reflect the feelings or emotions of a character or of a moment. And supernatural imagery. So you remember from your work on context that there is a lot of elements of the supernatural and of the Gothic in Jekyll and Hyde. And in this extract, you'll be able to see some of those features pop up. So just more generally, before we look at some of the key quotes, you'll find that throughout the novel, Stevenson uses the setting of London to create this sense of menace, this sinister darkness to surround the events in the book, and this sense of decay. So not only physical decay where buildings, etc. decay, but also moral decay, where what Hyde does and what he gets up to becomes worse and worse, okay, showing that he has no morals or no conscience. And Stevenson uses the setting to reflect that. Soho, where Hyde lives, was known in the Victorian era for being a place of vice and of crime. So vice meaning, where people indulge in things where they're seen as getting up to no good, and crime was rife in this area. You can see in the picture that I've put on this slide that the streets are incredibly narrow. There seems to be a lot of people. There's lots of windows, doorways, but at the same time, it's hard to see where one house ends and another begins. So that overcrowding, that sense of enclosure, the dirtiness, the pollution, all contributes to a place where criminals could get away with an awful lot. But the description in particular reflects Utterson's mood as well, the fact that he can't quite see what's actually going on, and the fact that his mood is being greatly affected by the events that are taking place, and his confusion over how Hyde is related to Jekyll and why he'd want to associate with someone like Hyde. So Gothic Elements wise, we've got one key quote, a great chocolate coloured pall that I've just highlighted here. Pall means a dark cloud, so the clouds are thick, okay, they are dark, menacing, and that would be a common thing to see in Victorian London. Because of the Industrial Revolution, there was mass pollution, and quite often you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. So this dark cloud that appears kind of matches the ugly nature of Hyde's life and what he gets up to. It's not an attractive or appealing setting, reflecting the fact that Hyde himself is not, an appealing person, and he gives this horrible sense of deformity. And importantly, that fog also provides the cover for what he gets up to, that criminal activity in the middle of the night. The quote about 9 a.m, saying it resembles twilight. So even though day should have broken by this point, it still looks like that time of the day where the sun's setting and visibility is at its worst. So we see that Utterson's really concerned about Dr. Jekyll's reputation through this kind of hazy lack of vision suggests that, Utterson is experiencing a more hazy view of Dr. Jekyll. He's very confused about what's happening. It shows the decline in Jekyll's reputation if it's found out that he's associated with a criminal. And we know that the Victorians were very obsessed and caught up in maintaining their reputation. And that fog as well creates this sense of things that are unseen. So the truth at this point of the situation is unseen. Utterson's journey isn't a nice one into Soho. We kind of get that representation of dirtiness, overcrowding again. And in the chapter as well, the district Soho is described as being a city that's in a nightmare. And the fact that the place is personified as being in a nightmare shows that Utterson feels afraid. He doesn't like being in this area of London, but it also creates a sense that the city is alive with darkness. It's full of crime, despair, and the unknown, which greatly contrasts with the description of Jekyll's house in chapter 3. So we've got that duality in setting, remembering that Stevenson uses setting to create that sense of menace, of decay, and of the unseen. Question 2, why Stevenson wants to make this scene dark and creepy. So, of course, because a murder happens, would be number one reason why Stevenson makes it so dark and creepy. It's carried out in darkness, of course, in the cover of night, so it makes that description of the murder even more menacing and random and terrifying to the reader. The details of the breaking of the walking stick, he hits Sir Danvers' career with such force that it snaps. We've got the audible shattering of the bones. showing the force behind that. To shatter someone's bones by hitting them with a walking stick takes some strength and some force and some violence. And the scene is also dark and creepy because, again, it emphasises this sense that Hyde is unnatural, he's deformed, which links us back to the Gothic tradition. Again, importantly, before we move on, raising questions: why is Jekyll involved with such a violent criminal? Question 3, why is it significant that Hyde lives in Soho? So I've just put up a map of London, and this is where Soho is, so where Hyde is living at this point. Of course, it's significant because the narrow passageways and the darkness would appeal to someone like Hyde that's involved in criminal activity. In the Victorian era, it's a place of corruption, female and male prostitution, drugs, whatever you wanted was available for a price in Soho. And this contrasts, as I said previously, greatly with where Dr. Jekyll lives, so near Leicester Square, which is near to Soho in London. And readers at the time would have realised that even though Soho is this dark, dingy, dirty neighbourhood, it's still very very near to where Dr. Jekyll lives. So geographically, the two settings are close, but they couldn't be more different because we know that Dr. Jekyll's house is described in a positive way in chapter 3. So the reader would have realised they were close to each other, which again symbolises duality in the novel. Interesting to note, however, that Dr. Lanyon lives in Cavendish Square, which is very far away from Leicester Square and Soho, where Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde live. So it shows that Dr. Lanyon is very much detached from Dr. Jekyll now at this point because of his meddling in science that Lanyon didn't like. And finally, number 4, what clues Hyde left behind in his house. So I've just extracted the paragraph there from chapter 4 with the description of what is left behind because it's not in the extract for this task. However, I've just picked out some pictures for things that Hyde left behind. First things that are described is the fact there's clothes on the floor, drawers are left open, there's fire embers, and in the fire embers there's a green checkbook. And then we've got the other half of the walking stick, so the other half of Dr. Jekyll's ornate walking stick. So all those clues link Hyde to the murder, but also link Hyde to Dr. Jekyll. A key bit of context finally for you with regards to what policing was like in the Victorian era, because obviously Utterson's with a police inspector at this point where he finds the clues. The police weren't looked on favourably in the Victorian era. It was really hard to trace criminals, as you can see, as I've put at the bottom. There was no forensics, no DNA, no fingerprinting. Policing itself was a new concept. It was set up by Robert Peel in 1829. So only 8 years before the Victorian era is categorised as starting in 1837. If you've ever heard the expression "Bobby" for a police before, that comes from Sir Robert Peel, who established the police force, because obviously Bob is a shortened name for Robert. But the police were really poorly, they were really poorly paid. They weren't seen as professional. They were seen as lower class, guilty of corruption. But although policing wasn't great, punishment for crimes was severe. So, if you trespassed or begged, you could just receive a fine. But theft, violence, often punished by imprisonment, or you would be transported to work colonies, so quite often to Australia. But punishment for murder was hanging. So seems a bit kind of ironic or to contrast the fact that the police weren't respected, but their punishments were severe. So hopefully that gives you an overview of the Gothic setting and why it's important in chapter 4.